Hi there, and welcome to our Microsoft Technical Takeoff session. This is, of course, from admin to standard user with Endpoint Privilege Management, and I am Mike Danoski. Joining me here,
I'm Don Brown. How are you?
So we are here today to talk about Endpoint Privilege Management. And right here in the title, we're talking about going from admin to standard user. And whether you're a beginner with Endpoint Privilege Management, we're just starting to understand how it can help you move on that journey towards standard user and really embrace that concept of least privilege within zero trust. This is going to be a good place for you to start. We've got a top 5 tips for you. Even if you're sort of a master of endpoint privilege management, you might pick up a tip or two here. So let's dive right in. So for our first tip, actually before we get to the tips, we're going to start off with just some basics about EPM. You know, it's always good to start with basics because it helps us make sure that everyone's sort of level set, and there's some key concepts that folks can miss out sometimes. First of all, endpoint management is built in to Microsoft Intune. It is part of the Intune suite. It can be licensed both part of the suite or it can be licensed as an individual add-on. Don, did you want to talk a little bit about least privilege?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we hear from customers is we want to tighten our security. And so the very first place to do that is evaluate the privileges that your users have. And so doing it as a least privilege first is the way to go. And we've designed EPM to step in to allow you to reduce users' rights on the local workstation from typically administrator down to a standard user.
That's right. And one of the challenges that you have when you move people towards standard user, of course, is how do you maintain sort of the workflows that those people are doing day in and day out? Maybe they have elevations that they do. Maybe they're infrequent. Like in my case, I don't do a lot of elevations throughout the day. It's usually when I'm building a new machine or I'm setting up for a new project or something. But then you, of course, have developers and folks who are doing a lot of elevations frequently. And so it's all about being able to move someone to standard user, but once they move to standard user and you're embracing that least privilege that they actually need to do their job, then you can use EPM to sort of help them elevate in those scenarios where administrator is required.
Yep, absolutely. And what we have here that we want to talk about today is a set of things we've discovered over time that will allow you to follow step by step to create some of the basics, the settings policy, some of the rules policy. We'll give you hints and tips and things that will help you be productive with EPM right away.
Awesome. And the one other thing I'll cover, it's not on this slide. This is like a bonus tip number 1. I think you're going to find well, maybe we'll keep count.
Ooh.
There's going to be a lot of bonus tips as we go through here. First bonus tip, I would just say, think about EPM as elevation. It's not necessarily the execution. And so we're talking very much about elevation. There are other Microsoft products like Microsoft App Control for Business, and so Windows App Control for Business. And so that's more about controlling the execution of applications. Really, when you think about EPM, it's all about the elevation and what's allowed to elevate and what's not allowed to elevate. Great. So we're going to get started with our first tip, and that is to get started fast and using EPM in audit mode. Like Don said, we talk to customers all the time, people who are using endpoint privilege management, some people who've maybe had some missteps, and some people who sort of have gotten into an analysis paralysis of sort of over planning at least that first step. And so this first tip is all about getting started quick.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dano. So if you want to advance on the next slide, we will take a look at what to do in EPM to actually get started. So in our management console, you'll go in, you will create first a configuration policy so that you enable the EPM agent is the first big thing that's there. The next thing is we don't really need to, at this phase, create a default elevation response. But the important part is that our elevation data for reporting is to yes, and then also our scope here, where laws apply, is set to collect every bit of information you can. Now, the idea here is that we want to observe what's happening with elevations or things that your users are doing in order to trigger an administrative response. What kinds of apps are they using that would ordinarily be running as administrator? Now, once EPM agent gets onboarded, enabled, the device gets the policy and starts reporting in the data, you as the IT administrator will see the information in the report later so that you can use one of the later tips in this slide deck in order to understand exactly what to do.
Yeah. And I'll comment on that as well, is getting into that analysis paralysis. Just turning on the reporting can start giving you a better idea of, like Don said, those elevations that are needed sort of in your environment. We've worked with customers who get to the point where they've done a lot of analysis and they're trying to go through, as any proper project manager should, and get through all of the end user communications, letting them know what's going to change and how they elevate going forward. But you can do this before you do any of that, because this has zero end user impact. They're not going to be using EPM for elevation at that point.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's correct, Dano. And furthermore, a bonus nugget of EPM goodness here is that we recommend doing this for at least a month, because we want to be able to observe the normal patterns that your users are doing and be able to then say, okay, we need a bunch of rules, or maybe we only need a few rules to create.
Awesome. Speaking about rules, let's jump into tip number 4. Putting your reporting to work. Let's start creating rules. And so the base policy that we just showed you is what happens when rules aren't present. So what happens for the normal day-to-day for elevation? And you can have that turned to user confirm so that people can elevate with very low friction. You can set that to support approval, so there's a little more friction and there's someone there sort of approving those. But if you want to streamline the work a little bit, the next step you have is creating some rules. And so creating rules from your report, this is something that we developed last year and shipped around September. And really what this can let you do is it lets you, now that you have your reporting flowing, take the information from your report in that elevation report and simply create a rule with the content already available from that elevation. If there's a certificate involved in the elevation, you can use the certificate in the new rule that you're creating. Let's say it's a PowerShell script that's not signed that someone's asking for elevation, or you see it in your report. Maybe it's a part of that person's daily job and you want to create a rule for it, or that group's daily activities. You can do that, and it's tied to the file hash. So when you're creating these rules from your report, it's going to automatically make sure that you're filling that minimum bar required that we have in rule creation, to make sure that it's not easy to spoof binaries. Things like file name, it's easy to simply, change the name of a file to make it look like something else. But when you get into signing certs and you get into file hash, you have more of a guarantee of what you're approving is what it says it is. So there's an easy way to create the rule. And when you do this, you can add the rule to an existing rule policy that you have, or you can create a new one. And if you add it to an existing one, it's going to deploy right away and match all the targeting that you have in that existing rule. If it's a new rule, then it's going to create it for you to go in and review. Maybe you want to make some tweaks. You want to take out the version requirements, stuff like that. You can go in and do that, and it won't actually impact your environment until you assign it.
Now, you could, for that matter, make the rules in your policies manually. There's no requirement that you have to use the report. This is just a convenience way for you to get started quickly. And that's what we're all about here, is getting started going with EPM in a frictionless way.
And I think we're on to bonus tip number 3. It might be 4. There might have been some that slipped in without announcement, but here's another one that I'm going to hand off to Don to go over. And this is creating automatic elevation for remote help installer.
Yep, absolutely. Now, remote help is another part of the Intune suite. And what we hear from customers is they want a very easy way for their users to not only obtain the app, but also to get it installed on their system. If you're a standard user, how are you going to download something and then install it? Well, what you can do is, using some of the properties that we've outlined here, you can just create an automatic elevation rule for the remote help installer. So that as a person, say they download it from Microsoft.com, now what? How do I install it? Well, they would just click into the install routine for it, and away they go, because the elevation will happen automatically for them with this kind of elevation type. So, doing things in these rules, you can have multiple rules, as you see along the left. This one has an elevation type of automatic. We can have other types of elevations there in your rules. Like, so we have an automatic install for the remote help. Maybe you wanted a support approved elevation for actual the remote help app itself, or whatever the app is that you're installing. That's a good case where you can put another rule here in this policy and have that applied to a different set of circumstances.
I'll call out too, we have coming out very soon deny rules, and it depends on when you watch this. Soon is relative. So in the spring, we'll be coming out with deny rules. And let's say that you're moving to remote help and now you have an old installer that you need to block elevation for. You have another app that you're replacing with remote help and you need to go block it. You can have deny rules to block elevations for things that you don't want your users installing. I'll come back to sort of say app control is definitely the preferred way to go and do that. But if it's just the installer and you just need to block that, you can absolutely use EPM in that case. Or not having it in one of your allow rules. Depends on what your base is. So it's very configurable based on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, so let's say that you have a version 3 of an app that you don't want. Maybe there's a security vulnerability discovered with it or something of that nature. You don't want your users to install v3, so you can put a deny rule in place for the v3 of the app. Identify it with signing certificate or the file hash, or get very specific about it, because the more details you put into those rules, the more precise your ability to target a specific scenario. Version 4 of the app might be great, and so do an automatic elevation for that, or user confirmed, or support approved elevation.
And Don and I have been highlighting a lot of the different options that are available and how configurable EPM can be when you're focusing on different scenarios. That's going to bring us into tip number 3. And tip number 3 is all about evaluating a user, because your goal, at least for initial rollout, should be reducing end user impact. You will be creating impact or friction if you're moving someone from administrator to standard user. And that's kind of the point. We see a lot of studies that show that there's help desk ticket goes down when people move to standard user, because the administrator users aren't going in and changing things that end up in help tickets when they eventually have something that's broken, or a driver that's not supported or something like that, or install some software that has some unintended consequences. And so for tip number 3, it's all about making sure that you're looking at a user by user basis, or even sort of like user scenarios, and understanding from the reporting what are their elevation needs. So if you're running as admin today and moving them over to standard user, or your users are standard user today, but they're using some other way to facilitate elevation, whether it's another Endpoint Privilege Management, EPM sort of administrative rights tool, or they're just running as admin today. With the reports, when you evaluate a user, you'll see all of the elevations that they're using today.
And we definitely don't want to negatively impact our users. We want our end user population as productive as they ever were. And like Dano said, to be able to step into ways to look at the users as an IT admin, first place to do that here with EPM is to check the elevation report by user. Once you see that, now you'll notice on this screen capture, we do have the username blanked out. You will see your users listed there so that you can pick a particular user and then see what elevations are they're going through in order to get a sense of what type of rules you want to create.
Yeah, there's currently 3 slices that we have for aggregate reports. And just as a reminder, or maybe as a piece of new information, our reports take around 24 hours to aggregate. This is not a real-time process inspection that we're performing. So those reports take about 24 hours, they get processed, and then when you look at the aggregations, you can look at them by user, you can look at them by publisher, or you can look at them by application. And then you can drill down and see individual versions of apps, different file hashes of different apps, if they're signed differently. And so you can really get into the details. But the idea here is when you're evaluating different user groups, you can see some of the trends over time or the really popular elevations that are going on in your environment. Sometimes this can be a surprise. It can be something that you didn't expect to see in your elevation reports. Or sometimes it might be something where you go, oh, you know what? We should just manage this app. Or, hey, we actually have this app managed already. We should just increase the scope of management so that these people don't have to worry about self-elevating to install it. Just let Intune handle the installation and update of it. The other thing that I'll point out here is you'll notice if you have a keen eye in the file here, you'll see some things that are sort of built into Windows. We have some changes that are coming up soon to remove those. But if you see those today for someone who's an administrator, these are unmanaged elevations that just naturally happen in Windows. When you move someone to standard user, it's totally normal to see a number of these just completely disappear because the user's no longer doing those elevations with that administrator token. So just a tip, that's like bonus tip. I think we're on 6, maybe 7 of just how you can make sense of this. So if you see like con host and dism host and stuff like that, or command prompt, you might want to just question why is command prompt elevating. It could be a part of an install sequence or something like that. But you can investigate that through the report so that you know that you're right sizing your rules for your environment. And when you don't know necessarily what rules that you need to create, one of the fallback options that you can have for your default elevation response, or even in a rule, is support approval. And so with support approval, what you can do is when someone has an elevation that doesn't fit a rule and it's your default for support approval, that user can issue a support approval request. When this happens, the support approval request shows up for the admin who's looking at the support approval requests in the Intune console, and they can see all the different approval requests and they can sort of reason over them. And so this is what it looks like. In this case, we're over in Endpoint Privilege Management. I'm looking at the elevation requests and I see this install printer MSI. We have all the information that you normally have in any elevation report. You can see the device, you can go click through and investigate the device, you can see whether the device is compliant, who the user is. You can also see the certificates if it's something that's signed. You can see when it was requested, you can see the justification. You can also see the file hash here. And a lot of these things you can sort of optically glance over and say, okay, this looks okay. But as I was sort of saying earlier, it is pretty trivial to spoof a file name in the case that someone is actually trying to launch malicious code in your environment in an elevated state. So something that we just recently added, and I say just recently as in the end of January, beginning of February, is this ability, if you are using Security Copilot, to analyze this elevation with Copilot. What this is going to do is it's going to take that file hash, which is unique to this specific file and this specific version of the file. If it gets edited, the file changes. It's going to take that file hash and hand it off to Microsoft Defender Threat Intelligence. And when it hands it off to Microsoft Defender Threat Intelligence, it's going to take that file hash and compare it against all of the intel that it has. And it's going to come back with a report letting you know what the classification is, what rules that it may have tripped. Hopefully most of the time you'll see this come back as, either unknown or no information because it's something that's harmless. But in the case that you do end up catching this in support approval, let's say I normally have a rule for this type of installer, but for some reason this file hash is different. So now it's popping in my support approval query. You can just simply ask Defender to give you that assist and say, hey, does this look okay? Is there anything I should know about this? And kind of give it that first step and sort of save you that time on research. Or maybe you aren't an experienced cybersecurity researcher and this sort of offloads that work for you for Defender Threat Intelligence to go and take a look. One other note that I'll have here, this is bonus tip. Again, another bonus tip is if you're using Security Copilot, Threat Intelligence is included in Security Copilot. So you don't need additional licensing to get this type of information. We are looking at ways that we can sort of incorporate this information natively back into those elevation requests. But for now, just if you are using Security Copilot, you can definitely take advantage of that by passing these file hashes over, and it can help you make a more informed decision.
Yep. And, just looking at the name of the file, Dano, I don't know that I would have been fooled or, allowed to install printer with an MSI. It seems like a great idea. Maybe I'm a traveling user and I go to an office location where someone gave me a link to go install a printer. And next thing you know, bad things are happening on my system. Right.
Or you read a blog and you click a link and you end up on one of those pages we've all seen with 15 different download links, and I don't know which one I'm looking at, and certainly our end users don't know what they're looking at, and the next thing you know, they're accidentally trying to elevate something. So this is a good check, a good way to sort of do that quick, easy check. And we have customers who've caught attacks this way through support approval, not using this specific Copilot integration, but using support approval where something just didn't feel right. And of course, they had a lot of experience in getting that gut feeling. And one of the things that we want to bring forward with Copilot is so that everyone can sort of get that goodness of being able to get that gut check.
Yeah, and I would say later in your EPM deployment, when you do switch your default settings policy over to support approved instead of no action required, that would be the kind of thing that you'd say, all right, now that I have a good history built up, I've got at least a month worth of data in my reports. I've seen the patterns that my users are doing. I've got a good sense of what kind of apps the user personas need to do their job. Then you can then go and make the changes to the defaults there so that you are taking what you've learned, taking what Copilot tells you, making good decisions to protect your company, to protect your org, to protect your business in general. And so that takes us into the next stage where we're at a steady point now. You've developed a routine. You've found the things that your users wanted to be able to do. So we've got a quick punch list here of items that you'll want to keep in mind. First things first, always be auditing. Just because you're now at a steady run state doesn't mean you should turn off reporting. In fact, that's when you want to keep it on, because like those things that will show up that you don't expect are going to be the ones that hurt the most. So always be auditing.
Yeah, in your auditing, you'll see managed versus unmanaged elevations. Managed basically means that EPM handled the elevation. It means that someone didn't go do right-click, run as admin, and enter in some other admin credentials that they have. It means that someone didn't go in and right-click or use some other sort of elevation tool in order to facilitate that elevation. Managed means that EPM handled it. Unmanaged means it was an elevation that took place outside of the bounds of EPM. And so as a goal, if you want to move it that way, is you want to think about minimizing your unmanaged elevations and maximizing your managed elevations and moving them over that. And that's all about potentially creating rules to facilitate those elevations, thinking about what other tools are in the environment that might be facilitating unmanaged elevations, and then sort of wrapping your policy around those unmanaged elevations and managed elevations. I think when we rolled this out, one of the things that we wanted to learn very quickly and that we learned very quickly is what our total app estate actually looked like. Because as you should know, the app estate isn't just the apps that you're deploying. It's all the applications and binaries and scripts and things that people are running in steady state in your environment. And so definitely go into this with an open mind about what you're going to see in your environment. We've worked with folks who see apps pop up in their reports that shouldn't have been running in the environment. It was an old tool they got rid of 5 or 10 years ago, and they still see it alive running in that environment. And so this is a good way to make sure that you're continuously auditing, taking the things that you want and adding them to policy and adding them to rules. But also, I'll throw another tip in here, another quick bonus tip. When you create your rules, you can specify the cert required that's to sign that binary. You can also, I think Don touched on it briefly, skimmed it, but I want to sort of come back to it, is you can also do your signing cert. So if you have developers who are creating apps frequently, you don't necessarily need to create a rule for each version of the certs that are used for signing. You can use one of your higher level certs in the chain. I wouldn't go all the way up to the top, of course. That's not good for anyone's security risk tolerance. It's somewhere in the middle. assert that you trust and that you know and that you can manage. And then what you can do is have a rule that's a little bit more broad, which is going to reduce your overhead on keeping up with that rule.
Absolutely. And as you go through the process, you'll find some patterns emerge. And what we've found and heard from customers is that aligning the actions that your users would do with a particular app. So an example of that might be an install action or an uninstall action or elevate the app itself. Those can all be rules that you place into a single policy. And so, think of the policy as the kind of the allowed elevations for the app, the life cycle of the app itself.
Another way I've seen folks organize their policy is they have all the apps that they want user confirmed in one policy. It can get a little bit hectic to manage because then you have, that list is going to grow over time. So maybe there's a sub-slice. But that way you can look at those and go, okay, everyone who's here is getting user confirmed for these apps. And then maybe you want a support approval version of the same rule for a different user set. So I think the meta point is make sure you're going in with a design or like iterate, and you can move the rules around. You can, since it's already in the report, when it runs again, just create another rule off of it and add it to another policy. So there's multiple ways you can do that. Anything else to add, Don?
I think that may be a good start for IT admins out there looking to get started quickly with EPM. We've
Absolutely
covered some basics, some things that you need to do step by step. We've got screen captures here of the admin console that you can use to get started. We've got some bonus tips that came along for the ride with us through the top 5 major tips that we had here, as well as kind of the running steady state type of options that we've seen have been used successfully with EPM. The last thing I'll say is that we are crazy for feedback. So if you have the opportunity in the Intune console, use the send a smile. It's a little smiley face there, and it just tells us that we're on the right track, or that there's something you need which we haven't thought about. And so we'd love to hear your feedback on everything that you do with EPM. Keep it coming in.
Yep, or leave feedback through Technical Takeoff. I'm sure we'll go through that feedback as it comes through as well. But yeah, absolutely. Send a smile, send a frown. Reach out, find ways to get in contact with us if you have any questions or suggestions, feedback, stuff like that, or find your closest Microsoft person that you know. But what we're trying to say is keep the feedback coming. This is what helps us make sure that we're building things that fit what you need. And of course, with something like Endpoint Privilege Management, where it's so close to the end user experience, it's something that we're really passionate about making sure that we get right. So we're all ears. Share your feedback. And of course, wrapping us up, I really wanted to thank you for joining our session and hanging out with us and going through our top tips. Again, I've been Mike Danoski, or Dano for short.
And I'm Don Brown.
And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.